challenge that had been voiced inappropriately before, now repackaged as policy. That moment clarified everything. This was no longer about rules or aesthetics or community standards. It was about power and about exploiting a perceived vulnerability. The HOA had mistaken restraint for weakness, silence for uncertainty, grief for inexperience. Preparation replaced reaction. Every document was reviewed again, not defensively, but strategically. Timelines were reconstructed. Authority was mapped. Jurisdiction was defined with precision. The land's history became relevant in ways it never had before. What had once been background context was now evidence. As the HOA escalated, so did scrutiny. Every action they took created a record. Every overreach clarified intent. Every demand exceeded their stated authority. What felt overwhelming at first began to feel predictable. Patterns emerged. Assumptions surfaced. Confidence gave way to exposure. The final escalation arrived without warning, packaged as a compliance ultimatum. It carried deadlines that couldn't reasonably be met, penalties that assumed refusal, and language that framed enforcement as inevitable. It was designed to force submission or provoke a mistake. Instead, it triggered something else entirely. The situation had moved beyond neighborhood politics, beyond petty authority, beyond fines and notices. The HOA had crossed from nuisance into liability. And while they believed they were tightening control, they had unknowingly positioned themselves at the center of a much larger reckoning. What happened next wouldn't be quiet. It wouldn't be administrative. And it wouldn't stay contained within the neighborhood. The moment everything broke open didn't happen behind closed doors or through another certified letter. It happened in the one place the HOA believed they were strongest. Out in the open, on record, surrounded by procedures they thought only worked in their favor. The meeting had been framed as routine. An agenda item buried beneath budget approvals and landscaping updates. A final determination regarding the property, its compliance status, and the HOA's asserted authority. The language was clinical, almost bored, as if the outcome were already settled and the process merely a formality. The confidence in the room was palpable. This was supposed to be the end of resistance. The room's energy changed. Confidence fractured. The certainty that had driven months of aggression evaporated in real time. This wasn't a misunderstanding to be smoothed over. It was a record of overreach. But the true turning point came when the inheritance itself was addressed. Not defensively, but definitively. The challenge that had been whispered, hinted at, and finally formalized was dismantled in full view. The legitimacy of ownership was affirmed not once, but redundantly across multiple authorities. There was no ambiguity left to exploit, no procedural crack to wedge open. The question that had been weaponized from the very beginning was answered so completely it ceased to exist. What made the moment devastating wasn't just that the HOA was wrong. It was that they had been wrong loudly, confidently, and repeatedly. Every attempt to assert power had been made on the assumption that resistance would fold. Instead, it had been documented. The consequences unfolded rapidly. The compliance ultimatum was rendered meaningless. The fines lost standing. The asserted oversight collapsed under scrutiny. And the individuals who had pushed hardest found themselves uncomfortably visible, their decisions now inseparable from the organization they claim to represent. There was no shouting, no dramatic exit, just the unmistakable realization that the structure they relied on had failed them the moment it was tested against reality. The climax wasn't victory in the traditional sense. It was exposure. It was the sudden inversion of power. The HOA had arrived expecting submission. They left facing accountability. And as the meeting moved on, awkwardly pretending normalcy could be restored, one truth lingered unspoken but undeniable. The conflict was over, but the consequences were just beginning. The aftermath didn't arrive with celebration. It arrived with silence. Where there had once been emails, notices, and deadlines, there was suddenly nothing. No follow-ups. No clarifications. No revised demands. The HOA's confidence hadn't just diminished. It had collapsed inward. The machinery that had moved so aggressively for months now stalled, unsure which lever was safe to pull, if any. The first visible change came quietly. Fines were rescinded without explanation. Outstanding balances vanished from records. References to the property were removed from meeting agendas. What had once been treated as an urgent community concern was now carefully avoided, as if saying its name might revive scrutiny. The land returned to being what it had always been, present, vast, and no longer contested. But consequences don't end where attention fades. Internally, the HOA began to fracture. Authority that relies on certainty does not survive exposure well. Board members who had championed enforcement distanced themselves from the decisions they once supported. Committees were reorganized. Legal counsel was changed. Policies were reviewed, a word often used when damage has already been done. The organization shifted from expansion to containment, focused less on control and more on preventing further liability. The individuals most responsible for the escalation did not disappear, but they did lose influence. Their names became associated with risk rather than order. Their certainty was replaced by caution. Where they once spoke freely, they now deferred. Where they once demanded compliance, they now avoided decision-making altogether. Power doesn't always vanish dramatically. Sometimes it simply stops being trusted. The community noticed. Residents who had quietly watched the situation unfold began asking questions. Not about the land, but about the HOA itself. Why certain actions had been taken. Why authority had been assumed rather than verified. Why a private inheritance had been treated as a public opportunity. The answers were unsatisfying, and that dissatisfaction lingered. What had been framed as enforcement was now understood as overreach. What had been sold as protection of standards was recognized as selective aggression. Trust, once fractured, proved difficult to restore. Attendance at meetings declined. Challenges increased. Compliance became less automatic. The illusion of unquestioned authority was gone. For the homeowner, life did not return to what it had been before the conflict. It became something else entirely. The land, once a background presence, now carried clarity. Its boundaries were no longer just physical. They were legal, historical, and indisputable. Documentation that had been assembled in defense became a permanent archive. Not out of paranoia, but out of understanding. Ownership, especially of something large, invites attention. Attention demands preparedness. Grief, too, changed shape. The inheritance was no longer defined solely by loss. It became tied to resilience, to responsibility fulfilled under pressure. What had been questioned publicly was now affirmed beyond doubt. Not just the right to own, but the ability to protect. The most lasting impact wasn't satisfaction. It was perspective. The experience exposed how easily authority can confuse visibility with entitlement. How quickly rules become weapons when applied without context. How vulnerability invites challenge from those who mistake restraint for weakness. It revealed that many systems rely less on legitimacy than on the assumption that no one will push back. But pushback doesn't require aggression. It requires precision. The conflict had been won not through confrontation, but through patience, documentation, and refusal to accept narratives that didn't align with reality. Each escalation had been met not with reaction, but with record-keeping. Each demand had been answered not emotionally, but structurally. In the end, the system had undone itself by leaving a trail too clear to deny. The HOA continued to exist, but it was altered. Its reach was shorter, its tone more cautious, its authority no longer assumed. Other properties benefited indirectly, protected not by new rules, but by newly established limits. Overreach, once revealed, becomes harder to repeat, and the land remained, unchanged by meetings or memos, unimpressed by authority that came late to a place that had existed long before it. It stood as quiet proof that not everything is subject to management, and not every space can be reduced to compliance. The resolution was not dramatic, but it was complete. The challenge ended where it began, with a question that had been asked without standing and answered with finality. Ownership was never the issue. Control was. And control, once tested, had failed. Looking back, the conflict revealed something uncomfortable but necessary. Systems built on power rather than purpose often expose themselves when they overextend. People who rely on intimidation tend to leave records behind. And those who assume silence means surrender rarely prepare for resistance, grounded in fact. Nothing was taken from the HOA. It simply lost what it never legitimately had. The experience left behind a lesson that extended far beyond one property or one neighborhood. Authority should always be questioned when it expands without justification. Rules should always be examined when they are enforced selectively. And power, when it senses vulnerability, often reveals its true nature. In the end, the land didn't need defending. It needed understanding. And once that understanding was made undeniable, everything else fell away. So the question lingers, not just for that community, but for any governed by similar structures. When authority knocks loudly, do we assume it has the right to enter, or do we ask it to prove it?